Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Hey, take a second. Before the emails, before the rush, just breathe. Now, let's get you caught up. The Connector from Boise State Public Radio brings you Idaho's news in just a few calm, clear minutes. Start your day grounded. Just press play. Listen to The Connector Idaho Daily News wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We'll get you updated on the news that made headlines this week. And today, our panel includes Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, Laura Guido with the Idaho Capital Sun, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, and Murphy Woodhouse, reporter with the Mountain West News Bureau. And today, we're starting with Murphy, who has an update on a story that we did on the growing homeowners insurance crisis in Idaho back in October. Now, Murphy's investigation found that in a 2-year period, there was an almost 40% hike in the average annual homeowners insurance costs. And in places like Caldwell, that cost has more than doubled. Now, Murphy has a new interactive website that includes maps, links to stories, and other resources. And he's joining us now to talk about the very latest on this. Murphy, good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here, though not going to be the bearer of a lot of great news.
True. So, Murphy, when you were on in late October, you had just gotten overview data from the Idaho Department of Insurance, and this was about the homeowners insurance situation here in our state. So, can you briefly remind us of some of those top line findings?
Yeah, no, I think some of those big numbers are great table setting for this conversation. So yeah, that was in late October, and then I just gotten a report and some kind of initial findings from the Idaho Department of Insurance. Here's what I called the big one, and that was the drop of some 40,000 homeowners insurance policies between 2022 and 2023, which works out to a roughly or nearly 9% drop in a single calendar year of total policies statewide. And so that was shocking for me to hear. But then, I had a great long interview with Idaho Insurance Director Dean Cameron about it. And he called that sort of a change very, very rare and a sign of unhealthiness in the marketplace. But beyond that, also evidence of substantial premium increases across the state. And so in short, an incomplete but very troubling picture of the situation here.
Mm-hmm. So, Murphy, what's the very latest information now on this?
Yeah, so we have a lot more information. So Cameron's office, they provided basically the full zip code level data from their mandatory data call to insurers operating in the state. I produced a pair of interactive maps and then worked with our colleague Katie Kloppenberg from our web team to put together a dedicated page for all of our insurance reporting. And so if folks are listening and curious about that, if you go to boisestatepublicradio.org, you'll see a blue text box with a checkered border with some text referring to insurance. That's the link to these resources, and I'd encourage anyone interested in this issue to go check that out. And I also do just want to say, Dean's office was very responsive to that request. I didn't even have to put in a records request. This is the public's data, and they treated it as such. So it's always nice to see public officials doing that. But anyway, with these maps, you can get a pretty granular look at this issue, again, down to the zip code level across the state, and the picture is just a very unsettling one.
So, Murphy, I've actually been looking at these maps this morning. They are really interesting. So let's dive into them a little bit more. So let's, for example, look at the average premium by zip code map, because there's
and I've got it up too, so we can just kind of explore together.
Yeah. Okay. So, let's go to the Sun Valley area. I think people, probably may not be surprised that maybe, costs have gone up, but they went up in the city of Ketchum by 55%. So, how dramatic is that?
Yeah, so I mean, in dollar terms, that's quite significant. So what we saw there, per the data from Dean Cameron's office, average premium in 2022 was about $3,700, which is quite above the state average. That's unsurprising. These are very high value properties, and of course, what insurance provides is the ability to rebuild. So it's like the actual cost of the structure. Obviously, many people are
Hmm.
aware there are many multi-million dollar homes there, but then that jumped over $2,000 again in just 2 years to nearly $5,800. So yeah, like the raw dollar change is one of the largest in the state, which is what you would expect, I guess, for a very high value real estate market. But then that percentage change of 55%, objectively large. But I mean that those are the sorts of numbers that we're seeing kind of all over state. Like right now, I'm literally just randomly selecting zip codes around Boise. I just selected Eagle 83616. There we saw a
Hmm.
43% 2 year increase, or over $760. Going east of Boise, 83712, $915 increase in 2 years to nearly $2,700. That there is a 52% increase, almost identical to what you were seeing in Ketchum. Again, I'm just very randomly selecting things. 39%, 83642, that's Meridian.
Yeah, I'm looking at
36%
that.
Payette, 83661. I mean, yeah, so I mean, folks are obviously going to have, their eyes are going to be drawn to where they live or where they have friends or family. But yeah, I mean, you can just use this map and go around and just see what other folks are dealing with. And then also, I think, just a nice way to illustrate state level stuff. It allows you to toggle between 22 and 24. When you click 2024, you just watch the state. I use kind of a purple scheme, but it
Yeah.
just gets noticeably darker.
Well, that's what I noticed right away, Murphy, was that toggle between 22 and 24, right? Because it's kind of this faded pink color in 2022. I mean, there's a little bit more dark pink, but not much. Then you hit that 2024 mark, and the entire state really lights up. But
Absolutely.
we talked about Caldwell, so let's talk about this again too, Murphy. So I toggled over to the 2024 for Caldwell in the 83605 area code.
Yeah.
Their average premium was $939 in 2022. It is above 1,300 now. I mean,
Yeah. And
that's
that's, oh, yeah, keep
significant.
going, please. Sorry.
No, I just say that's significant. So talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like, Idaho is a diverse state with lots of different sorts of people with different sorts of economic situations. And so while, $361 is, much smaller than the $2,000 jump in Sun Valley, obviously not everyone is going to be in the same position to deal with a substantial, ongoing, and likely continuously increasing expense, right? I mean, so if you're on a fixed
Mhm.
income or if you're low income, facing an additional $300 or $400 every single year, that's a big deal. And that's going to mean $300 or $400 less for other stuff. So, I mean, it really is. I mean, one of the points that Dean Cameron has been making to me repeatedly, as well as to, legislators and kind of anyone who'll listen, is just that this problem is everywhere. It's not just in the woods. It's not just in a handful of communities. I mean, we're
Mhm.
really seeing broad-based impacts in premiums, but then, of course, and also changes in policies.
Okay, so let's go down. Let's scroll down now on this web page to that next map, which you just mentioned, changes in policies by zip code from 2022 to 2024. Walk us through this map because this is now kind of a color scheme of like yellows, greens, kind of oranges. And there have been some pretty significant changes. And we've got these kind of almost red little dots around the state as well.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, so what this is representing is the change in policies in force. So we talked about this state level figure of a $40,000 collapse. So that's obviously going to be distributed differently across the state in different communities. And so what this map illustrates is the percent change in total policies. And so what really jumped out to me is, again, this is often a phenomenon that people think is kind of restricted to the wildlands, to wooded areas. But you
Hmm.
can basically see the Snake River Plain painted in oranges and reds, and the area that really just jumped out at me, that has really kind of like defied some of my understandings, is in and around Twin Falls. And so I'm zooming in right now to kind of around Burley and Rupert. But there's
Hmm.
one zip code, 8336. That's Hayburn. It's a smaller community, so there weren't as many policies. But there we saw things go from 1,267 policies in force in 2022, falling well over 200 to just over 1,000, or I think the more important number, a percentage change of 19%. I mean, what does that mean? That means that literally 1/5 of the insurance market, homeowners insurance market, appears to have gone away. I mean, and this is, as Dean Cameron has explained to me, driven by non-renewals and other similar phenomenon. So I mean, we're seeing dramatic, fast change, and then just like literally kind of arbitrarily clicking around. 16.75% drop in Burley, 83318, 634 policy drop. North
Hmm.
of Hayburn, Paul, 83347, a drop of 113 policies, or a nearly 16% drop. I mean, we are seeing very significant changes, as well as changes in places that I think a lot of people weren't expecting them. Certainly, I was surprised to see how heavily concentrated this issue was in the Snake River Plain.
So, Murphy, what's interesting too is if we head over to East Idaho and this change in policy, like, I mean, you mentioned Twin Falls, but Pocatello lost more than 1,000 policies.
Yeah,
So,
there you're.
I
Oh
mean,
yeah, keep going, please.
I mean, this is something where, as you said, it's not just these areas where we're thinking, oh, there's fire danger, right? So, oh, okay, they're not going to have a policy anymore. It almost seems like it's a blanket policy across the state that we're seeing, or policy change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we are seeing significant changes across the state, but then I'd like to, we're here in Boise, and like it's in and around like Metro Boise that we're also seeing some of
Mm-hmm.
these extraordinary shifts. Again, 83705. This is south of kind of the downtown area. There we
Mm-hmm.
see a 1,200 policy drop, 6,136 to just shy of 5,000. That's almost a 20%. I mean, basically the same thing that we saw in Hayburn. And again, like that's a 5-minute drive from where I am right now.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
and and
Murphy, can
so
I
and
ask you
so and
another?
so you said one thing that I do want to address there, which is like this is maybe not where the fire risk is. And I have more reporting to do to be able to speak a little bit more confidently about this. But actually, I
Mm-hmm.
think that, the Snake River Plain, I used to be in fire, and some of the fastest, most impressive fire behavior that I've ever seen has been in the Snake River Plain. So I think, some of this data is like, yes, this is a problem. Yes, it's in some of the places you'd expect, but some of the most substantial impacts are in places that haven't been on people's radar. So this map for me was a real wake up call, and I think it is for other people as well.
So, can you also talk to us about? So, I'm clicking around on this, and there are some areas, in particular in this change in policy map. It doesn't seem to be as significant in the average premiums by zip code map. There are some white areas where I can't click on anything, and so there's no information. Talk us through why that is.
Yeah, and that's and this is explained on the page, and I'm glad you brought that up because it may look like we're like missing significant data.
Yeah.
So this is zip code based, and I don't want to go too much in the weeds because it's a little complicated, but like zip codes aren't actually like discrete polygons. They're not like a county or like a taxing district. They're actually built by the postal service as like a series of lines and points for like the most efficient delivery of mail. And so what we're seeing here are what are called zip code tabulation areas, which the census has put together as kind of like a proxy for zip codes. So yeah, so there are just some areas where there might not even be like a PO box. So basically, these are like very low population, remote areas. And what I can say is that even though there are parts of the state that are missing, the
Mm-hmm.
like literally 99.9+% of policies are represented in what's mapped there.
So you've, as you've noted, you've had some really good conversations with Dean Cameron, and he's been very transparent. We should say last year the Idaho legislature did not pass any insurance reform measures. So, given this new data, and really how Dean Cameron has been talking about this, it seems hopefully like there's more awareness of this issue. Can we expect the legislature to potentially do anything of significance this coming legislative session?
Yeah, it's my feeling at this point that things are going to go very differently this year. Like I'm not going to predict that things are going to get passed, but
Yeah.
it feels like there's a lot of awareness, and obviously we have a lot of new data. And so this week I've been speaking with legislators concerned about this issue, and a few that are likely to push measures. And this week is like some consider it kind of the informal kickoff of the session. There's a number of events here in Boise, and let incoming legislators kind of gather for networking and also to learn about key issues. And so I was speaking with a number of these folks, and these were generally not on the record conversations, so I'm not going to name anyone, but I can
Hmm.
definitely say that concern is bipartisan and that legislators themselves are not immune from impacts of this phenomenon. And I even listened to a pair of bipartisan legislators toy with the idea of holding an open house in a heavily impacted area. Ours is obviously a very lopsided legislature in terms of GOP dominance, but this does appear to be an issue that is animating folks across party lines. And I hope to be able to say more about that soon. But in terms of specific policy proposals we might see, Dean Cameron's office is likely to push a very similar measure to last year, a mitigation fund that would support homeowners and others to make properties and neighborhoods more resilient to wildfires. But then we also have some ideas from Representative Mark Souder, who's a Republican who represents Sandpoint, and he has a very interesting profile, which includes a quite significant career in fire, mostly structure fire, but also significant wildland fire experience. And so he published an interesting article in the Sandpoint Reader last month that lays out some of his concerns and ideas. And I'm going to just read a quick paragraph here that kind of gets at some of his thinking here. Quote, in some respects, property insurance is like property tax. It's a bottom line cost that is unavoidable. It's something homeowners must pay so they can keep their mortgage. In some cases, it can make or break a first-time home buyer's loan qualification. The difficulty in finding insurance and the high cost can be a factor in home values and property sales too. Local business and our economy can be affected as well. So he's quite concerned about this, and then he also has some specific ideas that he puts out. He suggests maybe extending from 30 to 60 days the amount of time that insurers have to give policyholders when they're not going to renew, requiring more transparency from insurers on factors that influence premiums, which he thinks could encourage mitigation efforts, and just more information in general on what folks can do to bring premiums down and to incentivize home hardening, as well as working with local fire districts to, quote, embrace wildland fire, interface prevention and preparedness, which he hopes could also address premiums. But I think, in short, there are a lot of ideas out there, and I think a fair bit of concern. So I think that this is going to be a very interesting issue to watch during this upcoming, fast approaching legislative session.
Well, Murphy, we appreciate all of the really in-depth reporting you've been doing on this. And we want to let people, as a reminder, we do have those interactive maps on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. So Valley County just made two big land use decisions. They approved some fairly controversial zoning updates, and they also won a lawsuit over shrinking McCall's impact area. And now county officials say that an even bigger conversation about switching to traditional zoning could be coming next year. And Drew, I know you've been covering all of this very extensively. So, what immediate effects will residents and developers see come January 1st when the McCall impact area, when those changes take effect and the county's multi use system replaces what's been known as city aligned zoning?
Yeah, so I think you kind of hit on it right there with the multiple use zoning comment, but just to kind of bring everybody up to speed on what we're talking about, the McCall impact area for decades had been essentially a growth planning area outside of city limits on county land surrounding the city. It stretched around Payette Lake and south of town a little ways. But the boundaries of that have been shrunk tremendously. I believe 94% is the figure of how much smaller that zone is going to be, that impact area, come January 1st. But that's really less important than the administrative changes that you touched on. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
by city staff's own admission, the impact area is much less significant if the administrative changes that the county has proposed do in fact take effect, which they will. And that essentially is that for years, for decades, the impact area has been managed jointly by the city and the county. Um, and the county has, while they have held on to final say about land use decisions within that area, those decisions have been based on codes that largely resemble those in place within city limits. Basically, it provides a transition zone for continuity between the city and the county. That's the way the
Mm-hmm.
city viewed it, anyways. So come January 1st, all that goes out the window. Not only do the boundaries shrink, but the county will be implementing its own zoning standards and its multiple use system within that impact area. And so what that means is instead of traditional zoning where you have large swaths of land that they're zoned for certain residential densities or or certain commercial uses, these zones that kind of spell out what you can and can't do as far as land use, that all goes out the window, and the county's multiple use system comes in. And that is simply all proposals, all land use proposals are evaluated on a case by case basis. And
Mm,
so it
okay.
essentially comes down to how compatible is this land use with the existing surrounding uses. So that's the number one change that the developers and residents will see come January 1st. You know, from an administrative standpoint, land use applications outside of city limits will now go to the Valley County Planning and Zoning Commission rather than what was known as the McCall Area Planning and Zoning Commission. Um, that McCall Area Commission was made up of city representatives and impact area representatives. The impact area representatives will be taken off of that board, and now all development proposals outside of city limits will just go straight to Valley County.
Mm. So let's talk next about this lawsuit that the city of McCall just won. Can you briefly tell us what this was, and then has the city reacted to the lawsuit dismissal or outlined any plans to reengage with the county on this?
Yeah, so the lawsuit essentially was that the city felt the county's decision on the impact area was arbitrary. The city had proposed its own boundaries earlier this year. The city
Mm-hmm.
actually sought to, it would expand the impact area by a little bit, but largely the boundaries would remain as they are today. And the city developed this based on an overlay of all these different factors that you can kind of fit into the categories in state law for determining impact area boundaries. And so the city felt it had a data-driven proposal for why the boundaries should be what the city said they should be. The county did not go for that. The county, as we just discussed, went ahead with shrinking the impact area by 94%, um,
Mm-hmm.
and proceeding with the administrative changes as well. And so the city sued on the ground that, yeah, this was an arbitrary decision, and they felt that their proposal was backed up by state law. Ultimately, the judge ruled that the city did not have grounds in the lawsuit because of the fact that this is a legislative decision that is entrusted to the county by state law. And so that was essentially the grounds on which it got dismissed. However, the judge did also note that, even if the city's proposal did meet the criteria in state law, that did not obligate the county to accept it. Um, and I'm sorry, what was part two of that?
So I'm just curious about if they're going to reengage with the county at all then on any future like boundary or zoning discussions.
Well, I think between Valley County and the city of McCall, there's always something of an open door policy. These two agencies, they work together on a lot of different issues. They have their fingers
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of the same pies. I'm not aware of any specific plans at this point between the city and the county to or formal plans to reengage. I do know the county commissioners on a public hearing on Monday, they they heard loud and clear from more than a dozen people who spoke that they're interested in zoning. They're interested in
Mm-hmm.
traditional zoning across the county and replacing this multiple use system. Um, there's some support on the Board of County Commissioners to do that. Sherry Maupin, who chairs the board, went on record and has been on record for that matter for a while now that she would like to see the county traditionally zoned. And she said, look, that's my commitment to the future. I want to start this conversation. Where it goes, nobody knows. But there does appear to be enough momentum that there might be public workshops, town hall type forums, those sorts of things next year to at least talk about, what would it take to move away from that multiple use system towards traditional zoning.
Mm-hmm. And Drew, are there any like responses coming out? Maybe like I'm thinking either in support or maybe against from community groups, maybe developers. What about environmental advocates who've been following this?
Certainly, I mean it's kind of all over the map. There certainly seems to be more opposition And there often is, and these sorts of, situations, people who are unhappy about something are more likely to show up to the meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's we see that all the time, no matter the issue. Um, but there's some people as well who are happy to see these changes, who feel the multiple use system is a more equitable system that does support private property rights more. Um, I think that there are certainly environmental groups as well that are opposed to these changes. Friends of Lake Cascade, I think, submitted a comment um, in opposition. I know that they were at the same time as the county was doing this, they adopted some new uh, uh, water quality regulations. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of weird. You've got multiple things going on here, and a lot of people feel good about those new water quality protection measures, but not so great about the multiple use zoning. And so it's kind of been convoluted.
So, Laura, the Idaho legislature is heading into the 2026 legislative session really within weeks. And as we've been reporting, and as many outlets have been reporting, there's a big budget shortfall. And there will likely be an even bigger issue on hand when lawmakers have to decide whether or not to implement new federal tax cuts. Because my understanding is this could potentially deepen our state's deficit even more. So, with all of that said, Laura, what's the biggest point of disagreement among our state leaders? I mean, are they more divided over what caused the deficit or how to fix it?
Um, a little bit of both. I mean, there's pretty much general agreement among everyone that cuts will be needed. Like, there's no getting around that. So everyone pretty
Hmm.
much agrees about that. In terms of what caused it, I mean, at the Associated Taxpayer of Idaho conference this week, Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke basically said in pretty clear terms, he said the legislature this year did, he said kind of backwards, almost budget making. He said he accused them basically of coming up with their priorities and then kind of retroactively picking a budget number or a revenue number projection that would fit those priorities. Um,
Hmm.
the budget writers disagreed with that. They said they did their best to get a consensus number on the revenue, which is something they all have to vote on and approve before when they make the budget. Um, there's also some disagreement over if this is just kind of a natural result of the federal funds that came through during the pandemic drying up, and this is just kind of where we're at now, and this is supposed to be more normal. Uh, so there's sort of different ideas about that. And then there's also some different ideas about whether Idaho should use its, roughly $1.4 billion of reserves to cover any of these
Hmm.
shortfalls.
So, Laura, did any lawmakers hint at specific programs or agencies that could face the biggest cuts? Because, as you said, there are going to be cuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've already seen is just about everyone is going to be affected. I mean, the governor this year, when he directed agencies to do the 3% holdbacks, that was everyone except for K-12 schools. Um, no one's named anything necessarily yet, but the two biggest pieces of the budget pie are K-12 schools and Medicaid. So it seems if there's going to be a large number that needs to be reached to cover this deficit, this potential deficit, everything's still based
Hmm.
on projections at the moment. It's pretty unlikely that those things would remain untouched. And I think that's going to be tricky because, Governor Little has tried to keep cuts away from K-12 spending. It's kind of been his priority
Hmm.
to increase K-12 spending. Um, but there might have to be some concessions there. And then Medicaid's also tricky because, if people get services, Idaho has to pay its bills. There's not really an option to just not. And a lot of people rely on services that are considered optional under Medicaid, but in terms of the people using them to live, I think those are going to be some really difficult decisions.
So, how realistic is it then that Idaho will end up adopting these federal tax changes? Because it's got about what $160 million price tag. when we're looking at these broader budget pressures?
Yeah, it's interesting because it would be highly unusual if we didn't conform to the federal tax code. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
something that technically the legislature does have to vote on it every year, but it tends to happen more or less automatically. It comes up early in the session. They try and get it done as quickly as they can so people can prepare their taxes. It has generally very little opposition. This year, it will be much more of a conversation. I mean, I think, Bedke, again, highly discouraged not conforming because, a lot of these federal changes were under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They were a lot of President Trump's priorities. And he said it wouldn't look very good if we're, you know, some of the things like no tax on tips or no tax on
Mm-hmm.
overtime have been highly advertised, and it might make Idaho less competitive if we don't have those, as well as some of the business incentives. But, the legislature might have to be looking at their numbers, and they'll have to decide if they can afford another, roughly 167 million
Mm-hmm.
revenue reduction as they're trying to balance a budget.
Well, and Laura, what should folks, understand about these political dynamics? And what I mean by that is like, do we know like who's driving to maybe try to push for conformity? But is there anyone who's signaling some type of resistance to this?
Um, well, like I said, Lieutenant Governor Budge really sent a strong message that he doesn't think it's a good idea to not conform. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like members of the legislature are more willing to have that conversation. No one's hinted that, no one's necessarily pushing to not conform at this moment, at least publicly, but
Mm-hmm.
it seems like there's a lot of conversations going on, not in public, about what some of the implications of these might be.
Mm-hmm.
Could I
Logan,
jump
let
in
me
for a
bring.
second, Gemma?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to bring you in too, Logan, because we've discussed this, and I think if people have lived in Idaho for a time, to understand that this is, I think, very shocking that we have a revenue shortfall because we have historically always had a huge surplus. And also, our state constitution says we must have a balanced budget. So, how in the world did we get here and in this situation?
Sure, definitely. I want to stick on the tax conformity thing for just a second, though, because I think Laura had some
Absolutely.
great points there. Ultimately, come January, where this discussion is going to have to happen in public is going to be the House Revenue and Taxation Committee. Our state
Mm,
constitution says revenue raising bills have to start in the House. Taxes is the House's baby. They're very defensive of that power. So it's really going to be the ball is going to be in the House's court when these conversations start. So that'll be the place to watch for that.
okay.
We haven't always run super huge budget surpluses in Idaho. Some years we do. Especially after the COVID pandemic, we really did. There was a point where the budget surplus hit $2 billion, the billion with a B, and the
Mhm.
Governor Little called an entire special session to divvy up that surplus revenue money and give it some to schools, some back to the taxpayers, invest it in other places. And now we're in totally the reverse situation, like we've noticed. So if the legislature doesn't have enough money on hand to pay for government services, they're going to have to start cutting things because we're a balanced budget required state, like you said. Um, for some folks in the legislature, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. If they're going to the state house with the goal of shrinking government and cutting budgets, the best way to shrink government is to not have enough money to pay for all of it. So some people might ideologically just be pushing to conform with the federal tax changes because that means less money for Idaho and more cuts that we're
Mm,
going to have to make to shrink government. And that's for a lot of folks in the state house, that's just kind of an ideologically good thing in their eyes. Um,
that's
Here,
so
however,
interesting.
sorry if you want to jump in.
No, no, I just said that's very interesting, Logan. So please continue.
That's one thing to keep in mind. We're a very Republican state, and a lot of people run for the legislature because they want taxes to be lower. Um, now, recently, the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy put out a really interesting report that over the last 4 or 5 years, with all of the successive rounds of tax cuts that the legislature has passed, first lowering rates and then combining the different uh, tiers of tax rates down into one single tax rate and then lowering that tax rate even further. Basically, the report said, had we not made any of those changes, Idaho would have another $4 billion on hand to pay for all of these things. So it's really kind of a situation where the legislature has prioritized cutting taxes over nearly everything else. And to be fair to the legislature, they've put a lot of money into education, they've put a lot of money into roads, they've invested a lot of money into needs across the state. But they've also invested a lot of money in lowering taxes and giving tax refund checks back to the citizens and whatnot. And the Idaho Capital Sun had some really interesting reporting recently where it was the Idaho Sheriff's Association, which I don't think of as being the most liberal tax and spend Democrat group of people. The Idaho Sheriff's Association said that the legislature was overly aggressive about cutting taxes and was jeopardizing the safety of the citizens by not paying for all these
Mm.
basic services that we need. So if we've got the Sheriff's Association saying
Yeah.
that, I think that's pretty notable. But here we are in a situation where the legislature is going to have to make some pretty tough decisions about what they're going to pay for, because
hmm
I'm not a betting man, but I would never bet on them starting a conversation about raising taxes in the state house, especially when we're not in like a totally urgent crisis moment. Revenues are low, but
hmm
like Representative Wendy Horman, who's the House budget chair, it's not raining yet. I think Governor Little's quote was, "There's a few clouds, but it's not raining yet." So
Oh,
we do have rainy day funds. It's about 1.4 billion. But if we
okay.
had
So
kept taxes where they were, we'd have another 4 billion on hand. So it's kind of
yeah.
a crisis of the legislature's own making, which they know.
So what? Okay, and so with that said, they've put some new procedures in place over at JFAC. That's the budget committee for folks who aren't aware of that acronym. Um,
Mhm.
how how do they affect what gets funded and what doesn't?
Sure, they've made really big changes in this newer era of JFAC. So it used to be each agency got its budget in a bill. So the Department of Corrections would have its whole budget in the Department of Corrections budget bill. More recently, they've broken those things apart into what's called the maintenance budgets and the enhancement budgets. Listeners of the show might be familiar with those. We've talked about them a few times.
Mhm.
So the enhancement budgets, they take a whole bunch of agencies and basically they call it what it takes to keep the lights on. And that gets bundled up into several big maintenance budget bills. And then the enhancements are for each agency individually what they need that's new for the year. Now, splitting those two things up has kind of accidentally created a gray area in the middle in what we're calling replacement items. So these are things that aren't necessarily new, but they aren't necessarily stuff that needs paid for every year. So I think my favorite example is like the bulletproof vests that the Idaho State Police has. Those are on about a
Mhm.
7-year replacement cycle. So it's not something that gets put into the maintenance budget because you're not paying for it every year. And it's not something that's really in the enhancement budget because you're not buying new bulletproof vests, you're replacing the existing bulletproof vests. And so we've kind of been in a spot where they haven't figured out where to put these replacement items. Sometimes they've been in the maintenance budget, some of them have been in the enhancement budget. Last year, they took all of just the replacement items and put them in one bill by itself, which was a really small amount of money. And the debate on that bill lasted for so long. I think it was Senator Carl Bierke, who's the vice chair on the Senate side of the Senate committee. He said, "We tried to do a good thing by pulling out these replacement items, but no good deed goes unpunished," I guess, just commenting on how much scrutiny
Ah,
that tiny amount of money got compared to the rest of it. So I haven't heard how exactly they're going to handle the replacement items for this upcoming year. Um, but sometimes those things are important things that kind of fall by the wayside in these budget conversations when we're talking about millions and millions of dollars all lumped up into one big maintenance bill.
So Logan, I have under 2 minutes left with all of you, and I do want to ask this final question to you because you're doing some reporting on what agencies are not asking for next year. Tell us about what you have found.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. This is a story that I hope to have out in the next week or two here. Governor Little directed the agencies to reduce their budgets by 3%, like we've talked about. He also told them to take out those replacement items that I was just talking about, if they're getting paid for by the general fund. And so the things like the bulletproof vests for Idaho State Police, they said, we're going to keep those. We're going to keep some IT networking equipment. But for a lot of these agencies, they're taking out computers and cybersecurity equipment that they say that they need to keep their agencies up and running. So I'm doing some reporting on that and some of the cybersecurity implications that come with state government offices having out-of-date tech equipment and how they struggle with finding revenue to pay for that.
All right. Well, Logan, would love to have you back on the show once you have done all this reporting and everything on that to have a bigger conversation. I want to thank all of our Reporter Roundtable today. I know we had a lot to get to, but I know there's some things we left on the table, but appreciate all of the reporting you've done. If, of course, you want to read all of the reporting from everyone, go to their website. But a big thank you to Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, Laura Guido with the Idaho Capital Sun, Murphy Woodhouse from the Mountain West News Bureau, and Logan Finney with Idaho Public Television. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
How does AI even work? Where does creativity come from? What's the secret to living longer? TED Radio Hour explores the biggest questions with some of the world's greatest thinkers. They will surprise, challenge, and even change you. Listen to NPR's TED Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.